This is an excerpt of episode 19, where Jacob Hands and I discussed at some length his disagreement with me on the topic of are seed oils a problem. I was asked to extract this portion of the episode 19 video by my co-host, Dr. Brian Kerley, because he thought that this would be a good standalone podcast and a lot easier to reference than digging through the 2.5 hours of the previous podcast. So this is an excerpt. If you've already listened to or watched episode 19, you can skip this one and we'll come out with another new podcast next week. If you haven't seen that and you're interested in this topic, Jacob's a smart guy and I think brings up a lot of really good points, and it was an excellent conversation. I'd like to thank Jacob for doing this, and of the topics that we discussed in that episode, this was what he wanted to cover because he wanted the opportunity to ask me some questions and go over some of the evidence, and I hope that it leads to further conversations because it was a very good one. So you wanted to get a little bit into omega-6.
Would you hate me if I did, Tucker? Because
Not
I
at
think
all. No, I think
maybe split hairs.
Go ahead, fire away.
Yeah. So listen, here's my thing: is that like O'Keefe back in 2016 or 2018 with I think Nicolantino had a really interesting piece in the BMJ.
He asked me to be a co-author on that paper, but I decided
did he
it
really?
wasn't a great idea.
No way! How interesting.
Yeah,
I really like
James. I mean, James, I think, Dr. O'Keefe. I saw him give a talk at Harvard University for the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2012, and it was about how running is bad for you. And I happened to be sitting next to Dan Lieberman, who at the time was the chairman of I think he still is, but at the time he was the chairman of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard and the world expert on running and barefoot running in human evolution. I deleted a long aside here about running and health. It's in the previous video if you're interested. All the runners that I know eat crap diets. Based on what I know about arterial calcification and atrial fibrillation, I would guess that's primarily coming from the diet. And it's probably a factor of, if you run a machine on a poor quality fuel, you're probably going to have worse performance out of the machine than if you're running it on the optimal fuel. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what runners eat, I can't, I don't think anybody could really call it optimal. I mean, it may be optimal for short-term performance, and that's fine, but, I don't think it's optimal for long-term health. It's pretty much equates to a junk food diet a lot of the time, although they're getting better. And there are a lot of people who, Zach Bitter, who pretty much does a paleo diet and has had great success. He's got a few world records. So I don't think you have to have a junk food diet to be a good runner, but so no, I'm very familiar with that paper, and they make some good arguments. I think it kind of comes back down to the same thing that we were talking about with omega-3s, right? I'm not aware of any population that takes high consumption of omega-3s and has a health problem. And in fact, you generally see that they are healthier. The Japanese, one of the longest lived big populations in the world, right? I mean, the one negative I've heard of was that they said that the Greenland Eskimos they thought had a higher stroke risk and they were more predisposed to bleeding. Those concerns haven't borne out in fish oil trials, and because of the small population, they weren't doing RCTs with these people. That was just anecdotes. It may have just been artifactual.
Well, genotypic differences also, especially in isolated populations, is going to make like a
I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that could happen. That so the flip side, omega-6 intake, right? Is there a population with an evolutionarily appropriate level of omega-6 intake that has our chronic diseases? And I found one. I finally did find one, but with that one exception, no.
Yeah. Well, so here's sort of my thing on this is that I've seen that hypothesis. I just linked that paper because I think it provides a very fair.
No, and it's a good paper, and they have a lot of, there are a lot of good references in there. I don't think they make a strong enough argument. I probably should have, in hindsight, worked with him on that, but I don't know. He gets into some flaky stuff that makes me a little nervous sometimes.
I understand. Well, what I'm saying is, it provides a good overview of sort of how to think about this mechanistically. So, you have people like, I'm trying to remember who. I mean, God knows, like Lane Norton, Nick Norwitz. Probably
no,
all.
Well, Nick, I know well. I think I think he and I are generally in agreement.
Really? Okay.
Unless you're thinking of Nick Hebert.
Oh, maybe I am. I was trying to remember.
God, poor Nick's going to die if you just made that mistake.
Oh gosh. Well, tell him I'm sorry. It was in reference to essentially that there's like a hullabaloo about omega-6 that's unfounded. I think so you might be right. It could be Nick Hebert. I'll have to
Nick Norwitz and I are, we have some slight differences, but I think we're generally in agreement. I've done a couple of podcasts with him and I talk to him pretty regularly.
Okay, so listen, I definitely take your word for it. I apologize to Mr. Norwitz if that's the case. But the reason I mention this is that I think that there's like a very big camp that does not understand, why you feel the way you do about omega-6, and there's another camp that thinks that omega-6 is, kind of the be all end all. So because we've had to survey the literature now multiple times on this, I have seen, let me preface this, so I apologize. I've seen no convincing evidence that omega-6 in any capacity is in a significant way on a population level leading to health outcomes that are reminiscent of most chronic disease. What I have seen, and I'm giving a very generous take on this, and I've linked several of the papers, is that you'll see modest effect size. So on some papers that do systematic analysis, you'll see 5, 10%, sometimes 20% relative, or essentially relative risk increase associated with higher omega-6 intake. Now, the problem with this is that, let's say I go to essentially LA, and I say, well, what's going on with LA, and is that making any difference in, let's just say, diabetes?
You mean linoleic acid?
Yes.
Oh,
and
sorry.
So, no, you're fine.
Okay.
Well, no,
I didn't know you meant like LA, the city, or something.
No. I apologize. I'm from LA, so perhaps it's spice. But yeah, take linoleic acid, right? So really interesting paper measures linoleic acid in multiple in linear doses and in adipose tissue. So when it's deposited in the fat and linear associations in terms of intake. And so what you find is that as linear intake goes up, the risk of type 2 diabetes goes down. And this was in not one, but I believe now 3 studies I've linked here. Again, if you say that omega-6 in and of itself, so not the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, but the omega-6 in and of itself is an issue, I cannot imagine that finding necessarily being the case. Second, and I will appropriately let you respond to this in as much detail because I'd be curious, I just mentioned that arachidonic acid, when you give it to people, right? Like, so you say, I'm going to increase arachidonic acid intake in meta-analysis. You don't actually see consistent differences in markers of inflammation. And so what I'm left with is this very complex understanding in which I would say, listen, and this is where I think a lot of the people who give you a lot of flack is like, I've seen a lot of animal models that say omega-6 is, terrible, but I've seen no good clinical evidence of it. But what I have seen good clinical evidence is that omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is important, and that probably having a higher ratio of omega-3 is important. That is indisputable. But I just don't see the effect sizes.
Yeah, well, I think omega-3 can be a confounder for some of the reasons we discussed before, right? It takes the place of omega-6 in tissues, and that can affect the products that are being produced in the body, right? So that's, for instance, in the animal model of obesity, that's my favorite animal model coming out of the NIH. The last podcast I did, episode 10 with Dalton Graham, reproduced that study. And what they found is DHA is protective against obesity in the animal model because DHA is taking the place of arachidonic acid in the gut wall, and the gut wall is therefore not producing the endocannabinoids that are triggering hyperphagia, right? So there's confounders, right? Absolutely, no question about it. I think that's one of the reasons why when we look at 2 similar populations side by side, one of them is having an obesity epidemic and the other is not, and they're genetically very similar, and I'm referring to China and Japan.
Yeah.
Japan has a high intake of fish and DHA and has for a long time, right? Even though, I mean, if we judge those two populations by the ALDH 2*2 mutation, they both have about 50% of that mutation, right? That's, I think, a 3,000 to 5,000 year old mutation. So these are basically two identical populations that are having a very different experience right now. And DHA consumption could be explaining that, right? So when you say population studies, who are your controls?
Yeah, and I think I brought this up with you.
Yeah, you did. You put it in the document.
Yeah, there is no sufficient control for omega-6 because omega-6 is everywhere. I understand.
It's ubiquitous.
Yes.
Right.
But that still doesn't change, and this is why I brought it up. The linear association that you see, the inverse linear association that you see in meta-analysis for several different conditions with linoleic acid.
I've looked through a lot of those. One of the papers that you saw was a Dariush Mozaffarian paper.
Yes. Yes.
And I've gone through his line of research. The first paper in the line that I'm going to discuss was something he did in 2011, where he looked at the obesogenic quality of foods in the American diet, right? Looking at the nurses' health. They did 3 studies. I can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but one of them was the nurses' health study, and then there was like a physician's health study, and a third. And they went through and analyzed obesity based on all the foods that everybody ate. And the most obesogenic food, far and away, were fried potatoes, right?
Yes.
Like 5 to 7 times as obesogenic as everything else in the diet. They compared them, and the way they presented the data was, let's just say, if I had seen somebody doing this back in my Wall Street career, when my job was identifying fraud, I would have called this fraud. They were trying to hide a result, right? Because what they didn't make clear, and in fact, what did they say? They said, here are fried potatoes, they're highly obesogenic, and they combined certain kinds of fried potatoes with other kinds of unfried potatoes, like mashed potatoes, boiled potatoes, and which are not obesogenic, right? So what's the difference between a French fry and a boiled potato, right? One has 2 ingredients, potato and salt, and the other has 3 ingredients, potato, salt, and seed oils, right? So they found that the most obesogenic food is this food that's high in seed oils and is very high in the diet, and where we have a clear pathway from the product, the French fry, to the end result, obesity, right? Through an omega-6 dependent pathway. Okay. So then he comes out with another paper, and they look at linoleic acid consumption in the United States, and they find that there is a linear relationship, and diabetes. And they find that there is a linear direct relationship between omega-6 consumption and diabetes in the United States.
Hold on. Would you submit, or at least grant, that the majority of papers looking at that have found the opposite?
Let's talk about what they did next.
Okay.
They adjusted it by body weight, body mass. But they already knew that body mass is in the pathway that they're looking at, because they published a paper showing that, right? And I wasn't the only one who noticed this. Joseph Hibeln, I wrote a post about this, and then after the post, somebody pointed out, oh, this guy commented on their paper saying that the explanation could be that linoleic acid is causing obesity in the French fries, right? Hibeln wrote the 2012 paper that I mentioned showing the animal pathway to obesity. Okay, so if you take a causal pathway, it is invalid to adjust the end result by another component of the same causal pathway, right? You're hiding the result, right? It would be like if you can help me with a better analogy, please, but this is the only one I've been able to come up with. If you analyze the mortality of gunshot wounds and then adjusted it by bleeding, you could find that gunshot wounds aren't fatal when they're adjusted for bleeding, right? Because you're taking this and you're adjusting it by this when the correct association is really this, right? I went, and I have a pretty good, I'm not formally trained in statistics, but I did spend a couple decades of my life in Wall Street working with risk models and statistics and statistical analysis of data sets. So I have a pretty good idea what's going on, but I did reach out to a professional statistician and ask him about this. And he was like, his response was, they're cheating, right? They're adjusting by the causal pathway. Now, okay, so this is my opinion. A couple of years ago, they wrote a paper where they explicitly said that it's invalid to adjust diabetes by obesity because it's in the causal pathway. So then Mozaffarian goes on and writes, I don't know if it's this paper particularly, but there was another paper he wrote, which was a meta-analysis of all these papers showing no relationship between diabetes and linoleic acid, and every single one was adjusting for BMI, right? That's invalid. That is, in my opinion, in my experience on Wall Street, if I did that and my bosses found out about it, I mean, I would be worried about going out in handcuffs led by the SEC. And now why should we think that this is a real pathway? Because since the 1960s, the standard way to induce insulin resistance in humans has been injecting them with soybean oil.
Yeah, so I want to see that, like, the obesity aspect of this is not my strength for a number of reasons. So I've actually read back and forth criticisms about whether or not it induces obesity. I'm not sure.
It's a big and very complicated topic, and
I'm sure it is. And I don't presume. Listen, when you start getting to the hypothalamus and what regulates GLP, GIP, and how that interacts with the pituitary, it's a lot. The hunger center is a notoriously complicated thing that I don't want to touch.
Just one point I wanted. So I'm directly attacking Mozaffarian, who is one of the biggest figures in nutrition, right? I'm accusing him of not essentially research misconduct. I am accusing him of research misconduct here. Okay.
Yes.
Be perfectly clear about that. So recently,
I think it's clear.
Mozaffarian, there's an article, I think in the Atlantic, talking about some of his research, where he found that, he's a big pro-dairy guy, and I commend him for that. And he actually patented, while he was at Harvard, a fat found in dairy as protective against diabetes. Interesting little trivia there. Okay. A trans fat, by the way, interestingly enough. So he did this paper where he said that that there was no evidence of harm from dairy, and in fact, it was protective. And the most protective part of dairy was yogurt, right? Great. Everybody loves yogurt. When I grew up, there were ads on TV all the time talking about this population in Russia somewhere who ate lots of yogurt and lived forever, right? So everybody loves yogurt. But that wasn't all that he found. Just like in the potato paper, he found that there was something else that was just as beneficial as yogurt, and that's ice cream. But he didn't include that in his analysis. And when they interviewed him about it, he said, yeah, I forget exactly the language, but it was basically, yes, that paper wasn't entirely accurate. Okay, well, hiding research findings is scientific misconduct. So he's admitted that he does it. So, okay, so we get back to, three things. We have very problematic epidemiology done by people like Dariush Mozaffarian, where you have no control population. We have the worst part of the evidence, but the most conclusive, I don't want to say conclusive, the strongest, the biggest effect, the part that shows the biggest effect are the population studies, right? Where populations that don't eat industrial diets, what we call Western diets, don't have high rates of diabetes anywhere in the world. Okay. And then we have the mechanism.
Just to, because I want to earmark what you just said, because I think it's very interesting and directly bears on the point of what we're talking about right now.
Right.
Because I see something in a population average, like, yes, the US eats a lot of omega-6. The US is also fat and intakes sugar like there's no tomorrow. And the US also drinks in amounts and things that other countries don't. In other words, so whenever I hear that argument, I find it very difficult because
I did preface that with this is the worst part of the evidence.
oh, listen, I understand. I completely get it. I'm just sort of asking. So like take that gentleman out of the equation. So
Okay.
I could show you other, and I've linked them. I could show you a lot of other papers, Cochrane type papers, etc., where you can sample somebody's adipose tissue for linoleic acid, and you find an inverse risk associated with diabetes.
But you don't. That's the problem. You don't. If you look at the United States over the past century, and Stefan Guillenet did a paper launch. So, okay, there's I think it's, I'll link to this in the show notes, but there's a paper by a guy named Pierce looking at the epidemiology of ubiquitous factors, right? And the example they always give for this is smoking, right? Mm-hmm. If you're doing epidemiology on a group of smokers and they're all smokers, right? And you're examining people who smoke 2 packs a day versus people who smoke 5 packs a day, you might not find a risk of smoking for lung cancer. Why? Because the risk from lung cancer starts when you get to 1 pack a day, and they're both way past that list, right? It's ubiquitous in both sides, so you don't have a good control, right?
So listen, I'll see this to you.
Okay.
I really will.
So wait. So what Pierce, the point that Pierce made in this paper is that when you're looking at ubiquitous risk factors, there are things that we do standardly that don't work, right? Cohort studies don't work. RCTs don't work. If you're going to do an RCT on giving people linoleic acid, where are you going to find the group of people that's not eating it in an industrial country?
Sure.
Right? You can't. So, and his response was, in that case, when you're looking at a ubiquitous factor, you have to start looking at populations longitudinally, or you have to find a population, which is, what Weston Price famously did, went around the world and looked for people who didn't have the high rates of dental disease that he saw in his practice here in the United States and tried to figure out what the difference was, right? You need to do stuff like that. If you look at population intake of seed oils in the United States and diabetes prevalence in the United States, it goes up in lockstep. Absolutely goes up in lockstep. And that's all the way back to the middle of the 19th century, when diabetes stopped being a rare disease and seed oils were introduced to the population. And that's in adipose tissue goes up. Are there a lot of other factors that can affect this? Yes, there are genetic factors. There are other dietary factors. Sugar is a pro-oxidant of PUFA in humans. That's been shown. DHA seems to be protective. I haven't seen a study showing that it's, we know in the animal models and the big lousy population views, like I mentioned with the Japanese and the Chinese. But what you can't do is run a study and claim it's an RCT or a cohort study and have no control and then claim a conclusion.
So I'm going to again say to this point, okay, so effectively what you've said is that, listen, there's no control. And because there's no control, I'm going to say that there's population level evidence and there's circumstantial evidence
and there's mechanistic evidence.
Yes, I listen, I'm not beyond the point where I would admit that, of course. Like if you look at animal models, I have indeed
no human models.
Yes,
the
even
standard approach to induce insulin resistance in humans is to inject them with seed oils, and it has the same effect orally.
I will clarify, and I think it should be clarified, and I again will see this is not my expertise. When you introduce any fat in high doses, like you're under a ketogenic, tell me. I would like to know so if you have lots of fatty acids in the blood, right? So like you have insulin going up, you then have free fatty acid production, you are going to have insulin resistance. Would you say that, that this is a biological?
So the evidence base that we have in this area is total parenteral nutrition, right? TPN, which is if you have somebody who can't eat orally, you have to feed them with something. Back in the 50s, they started doing this with a glucose-only solution, and they very quickly started getting essential fatty acid deficiencies, right? So they started trying to come up with some fat formula that would, keep these people alive. God bless the doctors for doing
Yeah.
this work, and would also not, resolve the fatty acid deficiency. And what they did at the time they started doing this, they thought that fatty acid deficiency was entirely a product of not having enough linoleic acid in the diet. So they used a couple of different formulas. The one that they finally settled upon as least harmful, because they're all harmful, the least harmful was soybean oil, intralipid, which was invented in 1961. In 1964, they discovered that intralipid causes insulin resistance and hyperglycemia in humans, right? And ever since then, it's been the standard way to do it. Well, the problem with this is that a lot of the people who are on TPN die from liver failure in fairly short order. So they've done a lot of experimenting with the different fatty acids. And at this point, Mark Puder of Boston Children's is the guy who's been spearheading this research. They've found that it's clearly the linoleic acid that's causing the problem, because if you switch them, oh, by the way, I should have mentioned this before. This is one of my best pieces of evidence for why I don't think fish oil is harmful. There was a kid who was on intralipid, this soybean oil infusion, who was getting liver failure, and there are photographs of him online. He was, jaundiced, and they were expecting going to need a liver transplant and would probably die in short order. And they took him off the intralipid and they put him on a product called Omegaven, which is a fish oil infusion.
I'm familiar with it.
Okay. And they cured the liver failure. And last I heard, the kid was like 5 or 6 years later on a diet of primarily fish oil in perfect health, right?
It's interesting.
So yes, I should have mentioned that before, folks. By the way,
I don't, frankly, and I think Lane Norton and people who are as polarized as he is probably have a better mechanistic understanding, such that, like, for instance, I cannot explain how intralipid would do this, how it would not. I can maybe tell you that there's differences in oxidation and the replenishment of endogenous antioxidant systems through EPA, et cetera. My question is very targeted, which is that if I randomize a population to a linear increasing dose of arachidonic acid, okay, which I think you would admit is a problem, right? Like, you would say that.
Well, I mean, in the animal models, high levels of arachidonic is like super toxic.
Right. So again.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure that at some point you would wind up with dead people doing that. But
sure. But what I'm saying is up to a gram, and you can see the same thing with linoleic acid. If I give somebody an infusion of linoleic acid, probably up to a gram, well, I suppose it wouldn't be an infusion. If I orally ask you to consume around 1 to 2 grams, linearly, I cannot find any significant difference in a randomized controlled trial, generally speaking, with a linear dose. So I would like to clarify this, because if what you're saying is correct, then you should expect more equals worse. That is the first point. I do not.
No, that's you're making 2 mistakes there.
Sure.
Right. The first mistake. Excuse me?
I'm open to it, please.
Okay. The first mistake is that you're begging the question, right? You're assuming that you know what the harmful dose is and that you haven't already exceeded it.
Do you think somebody consumes more than 2 grams a day of omega-6?
Omega-6 is the leading source of calories in the United States at this point, right? Seed oils are, like, the numbers I've seen, seed oils comprise like 21% of our calories, right? But you're begging the question, what's the harmful dose? At what point does it become harmful?
Yeah, I guess again, I understand where you're getting at with this. All I'm asking is that if I'm measuring any marker that you and I care about,
so
and I give it a dose of arachidonic
that's
acid,
the second mistake. The second mistake is that a lot of nutrients, another paper I found talks about benzene, right? We can both agree that benzene is toxic. Well, it turns out, right? No argument there.
Yes, no argument.
So it turns out benzene's most toxic at low doses. At higher doses, it starts overwhelming the pathways, and the excess benzene doesn't cause any worse outcome than the first bit of benzene, right? There's threshold effects. We know that there are threshold effects with linoleic acid. This has been shown back in I don't have the study right in front of me, but this has been shown back in the 80s that there are fairly low thresholds for both omega-3s and omega-6 in the body.
So can you indulge me in two other smaller points? NGale Health did a plasma lipidomic study. It was a very, very large genetic study in
Is
which
this
they
in your
evaluated. I don't think so. So I
okay, well
promise I
we'll
will phrase
follow up
this
on
in
it later. I'd like
I
to put it
promise
in
I
the
will
show
phrase this
notes.
in a way. Yes, and I've also done a thread on this on my own Twitter, but I will phrase this in a way where I will allow every opportunity to respond to this. Point being, very large genetic analysis. They look at the factors underlying mortality, morbidity, etc. So they look at plasma biomarkers of mortality. Omega-6 in serum was protective in terms of plasma biomarkers of mortality. Omega-3
It's
in
associated with better outcomes.
yes, omega-3
Not
similarly
protective,
that
associated with better outcomes.
it was sure, but from the standpoint of if you had it in your plasma, you were less
Okay.
likely to die, and that was a linear increasing dose, as was the omega-3. However, when you controlled for the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, the lower that, or yes, the lower that ratio was, you saw the opposite take place. So, in other
Okay.
words, you started to see inverse or worse outcomes. So, I'm asking
With
again.
a high omega-6, low
Yes,
omega-3.
yes. So, I'm
Okay.
asking again. I
Well,
think that I think that you're
okay.
flipping this, and there's only one other piece that I will bring up, and I'm happy to move on to a different point of discussion. So if you are saying, listen, we're looking at two sides of the same coin, I'm saying I don't particularly see the evidence. I mean, listen, I could buy it. There's a threshold for omega-6. The systematic reviews aren't capturing it, the meta-analysis isn't capturing it. I'm not entirely sure. But if I say that omega-3 is the problem and you say omega-6 is the problem, don't I have slightly more of a leg to stand on if I look at all of those different pieces of information by saying a deficiency of omega-3 is the problem?
Oh, I would agree that we're deficient in omega-3.
Okay.
And I would definitely agree, as the Alfheim study showed, a resolving a deficiency in omega-3 can be beneficial. Is it enough to eliminate the need for reducing omega-6? I don't think that's the case, right?
That's interesting.
But I definitely, it's omega-3 is absolutely a confounder for omega-6. There's no question, right?
That's my problem is I've never been able to escape that confound. The last point I will bring up, and maybe this is beneficial to your listeners, the broad point that I've heard is like, listen, you got the omega-6 fatty acids that has then launched this horrific cascade of health effects. Yes, but so has sugar. If I plot the average level of glucose intake in a population, it's not a questionable thing in meta-analysis. Like, we're not going to sit here and debate a systematic review of what happens when a population consumes more added sugar. It's bad. There's advanced glycation end products, there's insulin resistance. I don't have to guess what happens. It's really bad.
Well,
So
it rots your face. That should be
of
enough.
course. I mean, listen, you get nitro. I mean, it's horrible. So what I'm sort of asking again is, you are a big fan of identifying gaps in statistical understanding, and I respect that as somebody who's interested in that. So why
Yep.
would we not concede that there's this huge question mark that's in the form of added sugar and ultra processing being added into the American diet, both levers, and both, by the way, are coincident with what you're talking about. Manufactured food is omega-6 laden, but it's also very laden added sugar and it's very ultra processed.
Okay. Well, you're a medical student. You're doing research. You answer the question for me. If you
I
want to
don't know,
resolve,
but I'm just
if you
I'm
want
just
to
saying.
resolve a question like that,
Yeah.
how would you do it in an animal model?
Well, what I'm saying is, it's not a matter of answering the question per se. Yes, there would need to
Well,
be a
but
better.
you're asking an excellent question. And I'm asking you, how would you resolve it in an animal model? And
I suppose
even better, has it been done? Right?
you just look at a Bayesian analysis. What I'm saying is, I've just
But
demonstrated.
Bayesian depends on your priors, right? If there's better data, your priors change.
Sure. What I'm saying is, let's look independently at priors. Okay, we just looked at a bunch of different systematic reviews, and your listener can, anybody can, and
They'll
omega
be
six
able
is
to. I will link them
yes.
all down in the show notes.
Omega-6 is going to be a complicated animal. And by the way, I'm not some zealot in either field. For instance, the Annals of Internal Medicine, which is an amazing journal, we recently just published with them, had their own Cochrane-style review in which they have no idea what to make of omega-6, was not protective for them, and they even said they don't know what to make of saturated fat. It wasn't the demon that a lot of people claim. So just understand, I'm in no camp here in
Okay.
terms of intensity.
No,
All
I
I'm
mean,
saying,
look,
yeah,
Jacob, I get it. If
yeah.
Darius Mozaffarian, on the one hand, dean of the School of Nutrition at Tufts University, is saying X, and I'm saying anti-X, then I've got a good argument that I better make.
Well, no, it's so I just want to clarify. I listen, I actually respect it because you've given a lot of information that I think is valid. And frankly, if the listener would like to look at the meta-analysis, it is, Lane Norton, the rest of them are going to claim the epidemiologic studies are clear. They're clear to an extent. It gets muddier when you look around. All I will say is that what is not clear, and this is the point I really want to stress, is that when I increase added sugar, if I randomize somebody to added sugar, if I do anything, every effect that you've just said, hyperinsulinemia, cancer, the incidence of coronary disease, it stops Alzheimer's. It stops becoming a matter of, maybe the meta-analysis doesn't show it. Maybe there's not a good control group. It's very clear with added sugar increasing, I will see horrible physiologic effects on an individual and on a population level. So I don't think we'll be able to answer.
Okay, two points I'd like to make here.
Yeah.
All those sugar studies are being done in industrial populations who have an industrial Western diet. I prefer to call it an industrial diet just because it gets the whole. I read a hilarious paper once upon a time written by an Indian scientist complaining that it was horrible that people were using the term Western diseases to describe diabetes because it was first discovered in India. And I was like, okay, so, there's diseases of civilization, diseases of wealth. I try and use the term industrial diet because I think that's really when the whole diet started to massively go sideways, right? Okay. So industrial diet, they're looking at populations who are eating all of this stuff. They're eating highly processed diets, right?
Sure.
Seed oils were introduced into the population in the late 1800s. Nutritional epidemiology didn't start until the middle of the 20th century, effectively, with Ansel Keys, who gets lots of credit for that.
Oh, yeah.
So again, no control population. Talk to me about populations that aren't eating an industrial diet and compare those to these industrial populations, and you see a very different picture. To your points about linear increases and high linoleic acid levels associating with health, we should discuss the situation of ARDS, which when I first started talking about this was an arcane topic that nobody had any interest. And then along came COVID and 22 million people died of ARDS around the world, right? ARDS is acute respiratory distress syndrome, right? ARDS. It's how COVID kills you. It's how SARS killed you. So they did a lot of research on it back when they were first doing SARS, right? What causes SARS? SARS is induced by leukotoxin diol. Leukotoxin diol is produced through the SEH pathway that Bruce Hammack discovered, right? It is 2 steps metabolically from linoleic acid in the body, right? It is part of the inflammatory pathway produced by neutrophils to fight off infections. If you have too much, it predisposes to death. They actually did a human RCT with this, looking at patients in an ICU who were on intralipid. And the patients who were on intralipid had 7 times the mortality rate, right? They did really good medicine in this study, but really bad science, because as they realized that they were killing all these people with intralipid, they titrated the intralipid down over the course of the study until nobody was getting intralipid at the end, and the mortality rate was next to nothing, right? So what happens in ARDS to your linoleic acid levels? They go down. High levels predispose you to get it. In the course of the disease, they go down because the linoleic acid is being converted to the thing that's killing you, right? HNE levels, the toxic aldehyde we were discussing before, go up. Leukotoxin diol levels go up. If you take leukotoxin diol, they did this study in Japan, and inject it into a dog, it will die of ARDS in 45 minutes, right? There's no question about causality here, right? High linoleic acid corresponds with longevity because these disease processes are a process of linoleic acid converting into metabolites that cause the disease in the body. ARDS is the clearest example of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so I think the point is that neither of us are.
Yeah, just looking at linoleic acid in the blood and saying, oh, this is, it correlates with health. Sure, it correlates with health. Until like ARDS, it kills you. Or
just so I understand.
That's an extreme example, but I think it's illustrative.
Well, let me I really want to get to this. So when you do long-term levels of omega-6, you have the same opinion on this? So like, again, you have multi-decade studies of high levels of, sorry, I said I was going to move topics, but it's just very interesting to me.
I don't
If
know.
you have a multi-decade
I
study,
threw a big one out there.
yeah, so if you have a multi-decade study of linoleic acid, which they have, and you see no significant increase in mortality, in fact, you might even see a signal of reduced
What?
mortality.
Okay,
So
go
what
ahead.
I'm asking you is, are you saying that the curtain never came and that it's just they were a ticking time bomb waiting for something to go off that never went off?
What what percentage of people get lung cancer from smoking?
Oh gosh, I mean it's a minority technically. It's probably 20%. I
10 to
don't
20.
know. Don't quote me on that. This is definitely not my
No, no,
area.
no, no, no. That's you're right. It's 10 to
Yeah.
20%.
Yeah.
So are we to conclude that smoking is okay because only 10 to 20% of the people? I mean, you're
Listen,
talking
you're
about
making a plausible argument. I feel
okay,
bad.
wait.
Yeah, yeah,
Let me just
yeah.
so you're talking about research that's done in populations who are eating industrial diets and
Mhm.
all have high levels of the chronic diseases that are contemporaneous, we would both agree, with industrial diets, right? So you're looking in a sick population. You're not doing controlled science. It's not controlled science, right? You can't, it's the example that I gave before of smoking, right? If smoking causes lung cancer at a pack a week, and you're looking at 2 packs versus 5 packs, you'd conclude that smoking has nothing to do with lung cancer because your incidence is the same in both levels. But obviously, that's not valid.
Yeah, it's just I don't think you'll ever see a study that says if I randomize somebody to more versus less cigarettes, that on average I would see somebody with a higher cigarette intake living longer. That is what is striking to me. Is that would be the
I,
example you
you
just
know,
gave.
I agree. But I mean, Mazafarian's done studies showing a linear relationship between linoleic acid consumption and diabetes until he adjusted it by body weight.
Listen,
Then the
I hope
effect
we
went
see it.
away. How
I hope
convenient.
we see it, Tucker. I really
Okay.
would like to see it. I appreciate. Thank you for engaging with it because I think that ultimately the listener is going to figure out, or whoever is going to figure out what the situation is, whether it's an omega-3 or omega-6 problem, or whether it's neither and it's an evil
Right.
sugar.
So, to
Yeah.
your point, though, the research that we need to be doing is the only research that you can do in when looking at something that's ubiquitous is take it away. Right.
No, I mean, listen,
And
I completely
then and
understand.
there have been a couple of studies that have taken it away and have shown good effects.
I can see that anything that increases omega-3, even if indirectly, is probably doing something beneficial. So that is an interesting discussion.